Well, good afternoon, everyone. I see it's just turned 12 noon. My name's Adrian Bertrand. I'm one of the co-founders and the practice head for ESG education at Six Capital's ESG Advisory. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the second of our three-part series on building a climate-ready business. What are some of the core strategies for adaptation and action that we can be taking as people with an interest in managing and mitigating climate change in our respective organizations. Hopefully you were able to join us for our first webinar in the series last month. This is the second webinar in the series, and our third webinar in the series will take place on the 2nd of October, and we really hope that you'll be able to join us then. Just a note to say that we will be taking questions via the chat function. So please do let us have your questions and we'll do our best to answer them. We'd also love to hear from you directly via email or a phone call. If there are other questions or you'd like to get in touch around any climate or ESG advisory support needs that you may have. We're really just an email away or a phone call away, and we'll be providing our contact details during the course of the webinar. Maybe just a quick overview of where Six Capital's ESG advisory fits into the Alternative Prosperity Group. So Six Capitals is one of the younger kids on the block when it comes to being part of the Alternative Prosperity Group. Six Capital started back in 2017 to help both corporates and investors in Southern Africa consider environmental, social, corporate governance, and climate issues, both in their business strategies, their investment strategies, and providing research and resources to help organizations have a greater impact, to really bring about improved outcomes for all South Africans and indeed for all stakeholders. Six Capitals has a growing team of consultants. We have three practice areas: the ESG education practice, which seeks to help both corporates, nonprofits, other stakeholders understand ESG, sustainability, and climate issues. And then we also have a strong focus on financial education, developing consumer financial education content that is compliant with the Financial Sector Code and also complies with socio-economic development initiatives, as well as running workshops and producing educational content. Our sister companies include Demystifies, which has a strong focus on BEE and ownership advisory, with a growing focus around diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of a holistic employee value proposition. Solve SA is our BEE solutions business, and they are partnering with a number of innovative implementing partners to also help transform our country and to achieve a greater impact. DNA Economics is another entity in our group where the Alternative Prosperity Group holds a minority stake. DNA Economics is an economic and development consulting, research, and policy house, and they work mostly with government and with other development finance type institutions. Value Capital is one of the new kids on the block, and they are a traditional corporate finance advisory firm. And then last but not least, our two social impact partners. Aclea Edu is the consumer education platform or initiative that Six Capital supports. It's a non-profit entity, and we use Aclea Edu to mobilize and to receive funding for consumer financial education as per the Financial Sector Code. And last but not least, our very own Alternative Prosperity Foundation focuses on Black leadership development amongst youth, women, and fiduciaries. with also a strong focus on diversity and inclusion. So as much as you've joined us today for a climate-focused webinar, we as the Alternative Prosperity Group and Six Capitals would love to be able to support you on your journey towards impact, both from a managing climate and ESG perspective, but also across the transformation spectrum. Our speakers today are going to be Nolene Padiachi, who is the practice head for climate change at Six Capitals ESG Advisory. If you were able to join us for the first webinar in the series, Nolene presented at our last webinar. And then joining Nolene is Sandy Nelson, who is one of our ESG advisors as part of the ESG advisory team. And I'm sure we're going to be learning a lot from both of them today. I had the opportunity to attend the Institute of Retirement Funds Africa conference on Monday and Tuesday this week, which brought together about 1,500 trustees, service providers to retirement funds, so your asset managers, your insurers, your banks. And it's no surprise that ESG, infrastructure, climate change were very much on the agenda. And there were some very practical examples of some of the climate risks that we are facing, both as businesses, as organizations, but increasingly as civil society, and the potential impacts of climate events and entities that have been affected by climate events actually seeking legal recourse against municipalities, where there is a view that insufficient action has been taken. And you might be aware of the Prospecton KZN Toyota manufacturing plant that was shut down during the extreme floods in the KZN area, and the insurance company for Toyota wanting to recover about 6 billion rand in claims from the local municipalities as well as national government, with a view that insufficient maintenance was done for stormwater drainage and other related responsibilities at municipal level. So just again, another example of how we need to be putting our heads together to address these risks. So what we'll be doing during the webinar is we'll be sharing a few resources which may be of interest to you. And we do encourage you to ask your questions, to make your comments, and we'll do our best to answer them during the webinar. And if not, please do get back in touch with us. Our contact details will be shared at the end of the webinar, and we'd love to have a conversation with you. So with that, it's my pleasure to hand over to Sandy Nelson, who will be taking us through the first part of the webinar, after which Sandy will hand over to Nolene. Thanks again for joining our session today. Thank you, Sandy.
Thanks so much, Adrian. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So just before I get into the content, so just an overview of the topics we'll be going through today. So up first, I'll be taking you through an overview of key ESG and sustainability frameworks and standards, and then also just touching on materiality assessments, looking at what this means and also the outcomes of those. And then later I'll be handing over to Nolene, who will be taking you through carbon accounting, the setting of climate targets, and also climate action and transition plans. And then after that, we'll just go through some of the key takeaways that came out of today's session. So without further ado, I'll just kick things off. So as we all know, the regulatory landscape for ESG and sustainability is rapidly evolving with the aim of enhancing transparency, driving sustainable investment, and also ensuring accountability in corporate sustainability efforts. So businesses must prepare for compliance with all of these frameworks, as they will have an impact on its financial disclosures, its supply chain management, and also just its overall business strategies. So this graphic that is laid out in this slide just shows us all the different, or some of the different ESG and sustainability frameworks, and also what they are. So up first on our far left-hand side, we have the TNFD framework. So TNFD stands for Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. So the TNFD helps businesses align with global biodiversity goals and also provides a framework for organizations to assess and also disclose their nature-related dependencies, the impacts, the risks, and also the opportunities. So the TNFD focuses on nature and biodiversity and was modeled after the TCFD, but obviously with a more a focus more on nature capital, such as things such as forests, water, and biodiversity. And then we have the SASB standards. So SASB creates a global baseline for industry-specific ESG disclosures and focuses on financial materiality of those ESG issues. The SASB standards were merged into the ISSB standards in 2021, and they are still widely referred to for sector-by-sector ESG metrics. Then if we look at the ISSB standards, so the International Sustainability Standards Board, they focus on creating a general sustainability framework or sustainability reporting for investors. They also established the IFRS S1 and S2 standards. So the intent of the ISSB standards is to improve the comparability and also consistency of ESG and sustainability reporting across different countries. And then we also have the Global Reporting Initiative. So this is one of the most widely used ESG reporting standards, covering topics such as climate, human rights, labor, and governance. And it's also multi-stakeholder orientated and not just focused on investors. So the GRI focuses on impact materiality, so how companies affect the environment, the society, and also the economy, and is complementary to the GRI. And then we also have the ICC reports. So the IPCC reports, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, provides an authoritative scientific assessment of climate change, its risks, and also its impacts. And this is the basis for global climate policy and also for corporate methodologies. So although the IPCC reports is not a reporting standard, it is a scientific foundation for many frameworks or many climate-related frameworks. Then we also have the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol provides a standards and tools for companies to both measure and also report on their greenhouse gas emissions across their Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol was jointly developed by the World Resources Institute and also the World Business Council for Sustainable Development in 2001. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is the most widely used methodology for carbon accounting across companies, cities, and countries. And it also connects the science, which comes from the IPCC reports, to practice. So basically bridging the climate research and corporate sustainability action. And then we also have the Carbon Disclosure Project. So the Carbon Disclosure Project, or also known as the CDP, is a non-profit disclosure system that collects self-reported environmental data from companies, cities, states, and governments. They act as a central data hub for environmental performance, which is usually used by investors, regulators, and other stakeholders. Then the CDP runs questionnaires that touch on different themes across the environmental space. So themes such as climate change, water security, forest, and supply chains. So if you look at supply chains, the CDP questionnaire focuses on things such as engagement with suppliers on environmental risks. And in terms of forest, we look at deforestation risk, commodity exposure. And then in terms of your water security and climate change, the CDP questionnaire focuses on things such as water risks, withdrawals, discharges, and also supply chain water dependency, and then also your greenhouse gas emissions, energy use, and your transition plans. So companies and governments then use these questionnaires to develop a self-report annually. So develop a report annually and via the standards of the CDP. And then these scores are then used by the investors, customers, and regulators to make decisions. And then we have IFRAG. So IFRAG is the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group. So the IFRAG ensures alignment between the European Union's rules and global frameworks, such as GRI and the ISSB that we mentioned earlier. And IFRAG also advises the European Commission on financial and sustainability reporting standards. The IFRAG also developed the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, which was developed under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And then lastly, we have the IFRS S1 and S2 standards. So IFRS S1 being the sustainability standard and IFRS S2 the climate standards. So these standards aim to create mandatory, comparable, investor-focused sustainability reporting, where IFRS S1 focuses on general disclosure requirements for sustainability related risks and opportunities, whereas IFRS S2 has more specific disclosure requirements for climate-related risks and opportunities. IFRS S2 was also built on the TCFD, which was recently disbanded. So the IFRS S2 structure is the same as the TCFD. So looking at areas under governance, risk management, and metrics. So the IFRS S1 and 2 has been adopted by many jurisdictions and are also in the process of being adopted by many others. So just some examples of jurisdictions that have adopted the IFRS S1 and S2 include Australia, Turkey, Brazil, and Hong Kong. So that was just a broad overview of the different ESG sustainability frameworks and standards without going into too much detail around them. So now that we've spoken through the different frameworks and we have an idea of what they are and what they entail, let's have a look at how they interact with each other. So this diagram maps the ecosystem of ESG and sustainability frameworks, showing how the different actors from scientific bodies to reporting organizations interact. So in the first block on the left-hand side, we have the IPCC and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So this serves as the scientific foundation, so to say. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, provides the scientific basis for understanding climate change, climate scenarios, and also climate impacts. So the outputs from these are widely used to shape methodologies and standards. So this is where Greenhouse Gas Protocol comes in. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's methodology is derived from the IPCC science. And the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, as mentioned earlier, is the most widely used standard for measuring and reporting greenhouse gas emissions. And it also underpins nearly all climate-related corporate reporting frameworks. So as we move on to the right-hand side, we look at the voluntary ESG reporting frameworks. So these are built on the methodologies that were just mentioned. So these help to create comparable disclosures, and they sit at the center of the diagram because they form the backbone of any ESG or corporate disclosure. So when we look at your voluntary ESG reporting framework, such as your GRI, IFRS, TCFD, they all relate to the science and the methodologies that has flown from your IPCC and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And also in terms of your target setting, the science-based targets, they use the data from the reporting reporting that you do through or with alignment to your GRI, your SASB, your TCFD is then used to align your company's goals with climate pathways, and then also the GHG Protocol, Greenhouse Gas Protocol data, and IPCC pathways are then translated into actionable decarbonization targets. So just once again, on your left-hand side, your IPCC and your Greenhouse Gas Protocol forms your scientific basis, which is then used to inform your voluntary ESG reporting and also the frameworks that you'll be reporting against. And then your reporting then informs the science-based targets that your company comes up with. And then this obviously helps companies translate these into actionable decarbonization targets and pathways. And then we go to the bottom, we have IFRAG. So this then ultimately feeds into the regulatory reporting. So this is where IFRAG comes in. So IFRAG plays a central role in developing the European sustainability reporting standards, and they also translate the global frameworks into mandatory regulatory requirements. So if IFRAG draws from frameworks like the GRI, the TCFD, and the global Greenhouse Gas Protocol to shape legally binding disclosure requirements. So in summary, what this diagram sets out is the flow from the science, which is IPCC, which then flows into the methodology, which is held in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which then informs your voluntary framework, such as your GRI, SASB, CDP, TCFD. And then this also feeds into the regulatory reporting, which is then established by IFRAG. So this move towards a more harmonized global sustainability reporting standards have accelerated a lot since 2024 and was also driven by efforts to improve the interoperability among frameworks and also reduce the burden of double reporting. So this diagram that we have here just illustrates the interoperability of standards, and also just showing how different standards and frameworks have not only evolved, but also merged and complemented each other over time. So up first, if we go to the bottom of the diagram, we have the CDP. So the Carbon Disclosure Project, the climate questionnaires are fully aligned with the TCFD recommendations, and they're also in the process of aligning to the disclosures of the ISSB. They also ensure that the questionnaires also ensure consistency with the GRI, so that companies don't do any double reporting. And then the data that is received from this is then fed into the SBTI and Greenhouse Gas Protocol in terms of target setting and also the tracking of emissions. So from the CDP, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board was then established. This was founded in 2007 with a focus on the environmental and climate disclosure standards. And then if we go over to our right-hand side, they are the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board and the International Integrated Reporting Council. So the SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, focuses on more sector-specific financial materiality standards for ESG, whereas the International Integrated Reporting Council focuses on integrated reporting, linking both financial and non-financial value creation. These two were then, so the CDSB and the Value Reporting Foundation were then later consolidated into the ISSB under IFRS. And then when we go to the top, so IFRS, which was built on the foundation of the TCFD, is now encompasses all these standards that we just mentioned at the bottom. So all of these have been consolidated into one to just take away the burden of double reporting, and also all the extra efforts of going and reporting into or according to all of these different standards. So the ISSB was established in 2021 by the IFRS Foundation with a mandate to create a global baseline for sustainability-related financial disclosures. And so, as we can see, it consolidates previous frameworks such as the CDSB and the SASB, and also the integrating reporting framework. So the ISSB complements GRI. So if ISSB looks more at the financial materiality aspect, we have GRI that focuses more on impact materiality. So the global reporting landscape is obviously converging. So with ISSB setting the tone for your financial materiality and your GRI setting the tone for your company's wider impacts. This then obviously reduces reporting burdens and also helps to support double materiality. So looking at double materiality, so what is materiality, or when we speak about materiality assessments, what does that entail? So a materiality assessment is an assessment of the importance of the different topics and issues for a business, as not all issues or not all topics are equally relevant or material, so to say. So the purpose of a materiality assessment is to understand which sustainability-related issues are important to your organization. And then following this identification of your material issues, they are then used to influence or inform your decision making. So why do we conduct your materiality assessments? So materiality assessments are done to prioritize sustainability topics for strategy, reporting, and also risk management. It also provides an evidence base for ESG strategies, for policies, and also disclosures which are related to the standards that we went through earlier. Your materiality assessment also informs decision making by identifying the most critical risks. So risks such as your climate risks or regulatory compliance, and then also your biggest opportunities. So looking at low carbon innovation or your social license to operate. And it also helps to reach your stakeholder expectations. So this slide just sets out some of the material issues that have been set out by SASB for the metals and mining industry. So SASB defines the metal and mining industry as the metals and mining industry is involved in extracting metals and minerals, producing ores, quarrying stones, smelting and manufacturing metals, refining metals, and providing mining supporting activities. Entities also produce iron ores, rare earth metals, and precious metals and stones. Larger entities in this industry are integrated vertically, from mining across global operations to wholesaling metals to customers. So the the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board has set out some material issues for SASB. So going from your environmental issues, being your greenhouse gas emissions, your air quality, energy management, water and waste management, your waste and hazardous materials management, and also your ecological impacts, to some of your social and governance material matters, such as your business ethics, labor practices, human rights and community relations, critical incident risk management, and also your employee and health and safety. So with the understanding of materiality, or what materiality is, what do we now define how do we define double materiality? So when we speak about double materiality, or when we view materiality, we have to take two primary perspectives into consideration. So one being the financial materiality, and then number two being the environmental and social materiality, which is also known as your impact materiality. So together this forms double materiality. So this then illustrates that the companies consider both how their activities impact the environment and society, and also how the environment and society will directly or indirectly impact their business as a result of either societal response to the company's activities and also the effects of environmental challenges such as climate change on the business. So if we look at financial materiality, here we'll have an outside-in perspective. So financial materiality focuses on the extent to which the environmental and social issues impact the company or the company's development and its performance and also its position. And then the primary audience for financial materiality is usually investors, as obviously as financial materiality directly relates to financial value. And then if we look at impact materiality, here we take more of an inside-out approach. So impact materiality considers the company's impact on climate and other environmental and social aspects, so irrespective of its direct financial impact on the company. The primary audience for your impact materiality includes customers, civil society, employees, and also investors. So double materiality recognizes that both perspectives are crucial for a more holistic understanding of your company's sustainability performance and also its broader impact. It also involves reviewing your current stakeholder engagement strategies and also identifying potential material topics relevant to your operations, drawing from frameworks like SASB, IFRS, GRI, like we mentioned earlier, where your GRI would then focus on your impact materiality and SASB on your financial materiality. So this process, there are different steps in this process. This process includes seeking input from your stakeholders on their priorities and their concerns as it relates to your sustainability performance. And then the feedback that you receive from your stakeholders are then used and documented and analyzed to identify your key themes, your material matters, so to say. And then from there, once your key themes have been identified, you would then conduct a preliminary assessment of the potential impact and the financial materiality of each topic, which is then followed by an in-depth analysis of the shortlisted topics. Then this would then lead to a materiality matrix. So your materiality matrix is where your topics or your themes that were identified gets ranked in terms of its impact or its financial materiality. And then this is all then summarized into a report, which is your double or your materiality report. So this assessment is crucial for focusing your efforts where they matter the most. So this helps you zone in on the matters that are most crucial for your business and your performance instead of having a look at every aspect, or because when we do look at the different frameworks and standards that are provided for ESG and sustainability reporting, there are a lot of themes that are set out, and themes and topics set out under these standards that are saying that you need to be disclosing. But your materiality assessment will help you identify which of these themes and topics are exactly relevant to your business and which of them you should actually be focusing on. So just an overview of the steps that you would follow when conducting a double materiality assessment. So firstly, you would connect with your stakeholders, obviously. So you would engage with relevant stakeholders to gather information about your organization's impact on the environment, the society, as well as your sustainability risks and opportunities. And then your step 2 would then be to determine which of these sustainability topics are relevant and material to your organization. So you would then consider factors such as sector activities, locations of your operations and also your entire value chain. And then step 3, you would then, once you've then identified the relevant sustainability topics for your organization, you would then evaluate its impact, its risks, and also its opportunities. So this would then involve considering both the significance in terms of its environmental and social impact, and then also its financial impact. So this step usually requires you to understand what's happening in your organization, what's happening in your value chain, and also just your overall sustainable developments that can affect your business in different ways. And then the 4th step would be to create a visual representation, such as a materiality matrix. So this would then identify your risks and opportunities and also how they are ranked. And then once you've developed your materiality matrix, you would then communicate your actions that have been planned in terms of how you're going to manage your environmental and societal impacts for each of the topics that you've identified. And also, this would include things such as disclosing metrics, targets, policies, and also your action plans. Then you should also account for sustainability topics in your strategic planning and also consider how they impact the business model and also just have the impact they might have on your broader value chain. So this is just an example of an outcome of a materiality assessment, of a double materiality assessment. So this example stems from the Airport Authority Hong Kong. So 40 issues were identified and grouped into 4 different categories, being economic and society, environment, operating practices, and people. So these risks were identified or classified in terms of importance to its stakeholders and to the business, where the importance to stakeholders would then be your impact materiality and then the importance to business being your financial materiality. So as you can see, the outcome has been plotted. You'll see the operating practices are of high importance to both the business and to the stakeholders. So it has both a high financial impact and also or financial materiality and also impact materiality. So this matrix is obviously crucial for identifying which ESG issues are most material, and then also it helps you then guide where you'll focus your strategic intents and also some gaps the organization might have. And but also this materiality matrix also helps you to see where the business and where business importance and stakeholder importance intersects. So in developing a response to your ESG and the integrating of ESG into your business, it's important to understand that there are different lenses or aspects that you need to bear in mind, and that you need to manage. So some of these lenses may overlap, but they assist the company to shape a more customized focus and also to achieve a more holistic view. It's also relevant for efficient reporting and also the application of relevant frameworks. So if we look at the different lenses, these have both an inward-looking approach and then some are outward-looking. So if we look at the operational lens, so this takes an inward-looking approach and focuses on the running of the business efficiently in either the short, medium, and the long term. The operational lens's key concerns are your cost management, your operational efficiencies, and also talent management. So when you look at your operational lens, we're asking ourselves, how do we sustain the business day to day and build resilience internally? And then if we look at the business lens, this is outward looking. So your business lens focuses on reputation and stakeholder facing issues. So here we look at how do we minimize negative impacts of the company's activities, So how do we optimize positive contributions to society and environment? And also you have a look at your responsible operations, supply chain practices, and also your stakeholder trust. So when we look at your business lens, we ask ourselves, so how does the business show responsibility in the eyes of customers, suppliers, regulators, and communities? And then our impact value lens. So this is also outward looking. Your impact value lens focuses on how the company affects society, environment, and the economy. So key concerns are managing ESG-related impacts. So things such as biodiversity, climate change, social equity, human rights, and then also just looking at meeting stakeholder expectations. So if we look at impact value, we are referring to, this is basically your impact materiality. So what impact do we have on the world around us? And then looking at your enterprise value, the final lens. So this is inward looking. So your enterprise value focuses on how ESG issues affect the company's ability to create value. So here we focus on things such as investor attraction and confidence, risk and opportunity management, and then also protecting and optimizing your enterprise value. So this speaks to your financial materiality. So how does sustainability risks and opportunities affect the company's value and its investor trust? So all in all, if we look at the different lenses, your double materiality is made up of your impact value and your enterprise value. So impact value as an outward approach. So how does the company impact the world? And then your enterprise value as an inward approach. So here we look at how sustainability issues impact the company's financial health. And then the business lens and the impact value lens. This helps to contextualize how these perspectives play out in a day-to-day management. So what does this look like for your internal operations, and also looking at external stakeholder relations. So looking at your supply chain and your company reputation. So looking back, your ESG frameworks, the methodologies, your greenhouse gas protocols, these all form a connected system that enables your company to measure, to report, and also to act sustainably. And then with all of these and with the help of your double materiality, you're then able to balance both your stakeholder expectations, also with your business resilience and growth. So this from the get-go, looking at the different ESG sustainability standards and frameworks, we then looked at how this feeds into your or what role this plays in terms of your double materiality assessment and the importance of the relevance of a double materiality assessment, what it speaks to, the different lenses, and then how your company would then use this information going forward. Yeah, so that is it from me. Nolene will now then take you further into carbon accounting and your target setting, which will then give you some further insight into the value of your frameworks and also your conducting of a double materiality assessment.
Thank you so much, Sandy, and good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so Sandy's touched on the importance of all of the ESG frameworks and how conducting a double materiality assessment can really help an organization to identify your material risks. Now, moving more towards the climate focus, one of the most important steps that a company can take on its climate change journey is learning how to manage its carbon footprint. And that's exactly where carbon accounting comes in. Now, by definition, carbon accounting is the process of measuring, tracking, and reporting the greenhouse gas emissions that an individual or an organization produces. This is both directly and indirectly. So you can think of it as the very first step in taking control of your environmental impact. Once you know what your emissions look like, only then can you actually start making meaningful plans to reduce them. And it's also important to remember that carbon accounting isn't just about carbon dioxide. In fact, there's several different greenhouse gases that contribute to global warming, but not all of them have the same effect. Some are actually far more potent than others. So for example, most of us are already familiar with carbon dioxide and methane. Carbon dioxide mainly comes from burning fossil fuels, whereas methane comes from biological sources mostly. But then we also have fluorinated gases. So these are your HFCs, PFCs, and SF6. Now, the fluorinated gases are a set of synthetic man-made gases that are often used in refrigeration, air conditioning, insulation, and certain industrial processes as well. Now, even though these are typically emitted in smaller quantities, they have an extremely high global warming potential. So when organizations prepare what we call a greenhouse gas inventory, they typically express all of these emissions in a single unit known as carbon dioxide equivalents. Now, this allows companies to compare and to report their emissions more consistently, no matter which gases are actually involved. So while a company should be actually assessing all of the greenhouse gases that they emit, the number that you often see reported is the total CO2 equivalent figure. And this normally aligns to whichever reporting framework or standard that the organization is following. Okay. Now, I would like to cover the reporting frameworks that are used for carbon accounting. So we've covered what carbon accounting is and the role of greenhouse gases. So let's move into the standards and frameworks that guide this process. Now I'm going to highlight 3 of the most widely recognized and commonly used one, and you'll recognize some of these as Sandy has mentioned them earlier on. Now the purpose of these standards is really important. They were developed to ensure consistency, accuracy, and most importantly, comparability across different organizations. So without these standards, every company would be measuring and reporting in completely different ways, which would make it nearly impossible to compare or benchmark what progress is being made. Now, first we have the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and this is by far the most widely used framework. It provides clear, comprehensive guidelines for measuring and reporting your emissions, and it even includes sector-specific standards to make the process easier to apply. Many people actually refer to the GHG Protocol as the gold standard for carbon accounting. Next, we have the IPCC guidelines, which were developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, these are a bit different because they were originally designed for countries and not necessarily for companies. So their main purpose is to help governments prepare national greenhouse gas inventories, which governments then report back to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So you could think of the IPCC guidelines as being the backbone of all the carbon accounting methods. So even frameworks like the GHG Protocol build directly on IPCC's methodologies. Now, for businesses, there may be specific cases where businesses are required to align more closely with the IPCC methods. For example, in South Africa, companies submitting pollution prevention plans will know that the reporting requirements are more aligned to IPCC methodologies. And finally, we have the ISO standards. ISO 14064 lays out the requirements for quantifying, for monitoring and reporting emissions and removals, while ISO 14065 focuses more on the validation and verification of those reports by independent bodies. So typically, companies turn to ISO standards when they're seeking certification or third-party verification of their carbon data. So these are especially relevant if you want to demonstrate credibility and compliance to some of your external stakeholders. So to sum it up, GHG Protocol is the practical, business-friendly standard. Most companies use this. The IPCC guidelines provide the scientific and methodological backbone, and the ISO standards come into play when you need certification and external validation. Okay. And then we have the scopes of carbon accounting. When we talk about greenhouse gas emissions and carbon accounting, you've probably heard the term scope 1, scope 2, and 3. Now, these come directly from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and they're simply a way of categorizing emissions into different groups, which I'm going to briefly go through now. So scope 1 covers all the emissions that come from sources that a company owns or directly controls. For example, if you're an industrial company and your facility produces process off gases that release greenhouse gases, then those count as scope 1. Or if your company owns company vehicles, then the fuel emissions associated with those vehicles are also regarded as scope 1. So the simple way to think about it is that scope 1 is what we burn ourselves. Then we have scope 2, which covers the emissions from the energy that you purchase. And this is most commonly electricity. So for example, the emissions from electricity that your company buys from Eskom, or if your company purchases steam or chilled water. Now, one important thing I want you to note here that if your organization owns or operates a diesel generator for backup power, then the emissions from that generator would fall under scope 1 and not scope 2 because the company directly controls and owns that source. So the quick way to remember scope 2 is what we use from the grid. And then we have scope 3, which is essentially everything else. And these are other indirect emissions that occur across your company's value chain, which includes both upstream and downstream sources. Now, the GHG protocol actually defines 15 subcategories of scope 3 emissions. Not all of these may be applicable to every company, but organizations need to assess which categories are most relevant and material when reporting on them. So think of scope 3 as everything that you're connected to, but don't directly control. Now, scope 1 and 2 emissions are usually easier to measure and control just because they're closer to a company's direct operations. Scope 3, on the other hand, is often the largest share of a company's total emissions, but it's also the hardest to measure and reduce. So by tracking across all 3 scopes, your company can get a much clearer picture of the total footprint and thereby identify where the biggest opportunities for reductions lie. So we've just walked through the 3 scopes of carbon accounting. Now I'd love to get a sense of where everyone here is at in their own company's journey. So let's do a quick poll. You should be seeing a question coming up on your screen shortly. I'd like you to answer, does your company currently disclose its greenhouse gas emissions? So take a moment to select the option that applies to your organization. Now I want to talk about scope 4 emissions. And have you heard about that? So this is a newer and less formal concept in carbon accounting. Okay. Now, you might have come across scope 4 emissions, but I want to clarify this a bit because it's not part of the official greenhouse gas protocol. Instead, it's a way of talking about avoided emissions, emissions that don't happen because of a company's product or a service that it offers. So here's a few examples to make it clearer. If you're a solar panel manufacturer, your avoided emissions come from the savings when your customer uses solar power instead of coal-fired electricity that they would normally have used. If you're a video conferencing platform, your avoided emissions are from fewer business flights that would have otherwise have taken place for business travel. If you make electric vehicles, your avoided emissions are the savings compared to traditional petrol or diesel cars. So scope 4 is really about highlighting the positive climate impact of solutions. It tells a story of the footprint that you help others avoid. Where scope 1, 2, and 3 are your own footprint, scope 4 is the footprint that you prevent through your influence. That said, there are some important caveats to take note of. Reporting on scope 4 is voluntary, it's not standardized. And it can be quite tricky to measure consistently. There's also the very real risk of double accounting occurring. So, for example, if both the solar panel factory and the electricity buyer claim the same savings. So that's why the GHG protocol doesn't formally recognize scope 4. Nonetheless, if your organization chooses to report on avoided emissions, it can be a powerful way to show the positive climate impact of what you do. and it often shapes how consumers and stakeholders perceive your role in the low carbon transition. So once we've measured our emissions through carbon accounting, the next question is, what do we actually do with that information? And this is where climate target setting comes in. Now, target setting is the process where companies and governments set measurable goals to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions over time. And these targets are usually aligned with global climate agreements, the most famous one being the Paris Agreement, which aims to limit global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And there's 5 key reasons why setting targets really matters. The first is that it keeps efforts aligned with science. Now, without clear targets, reductions might be random and inconsistent. Science-based targets make sure that reductions are in line with what is actually needed to avoid the worst-case climate change scenario. Secondly, targets drive accountability and progress. So targets, they act like a roadmap, and they require organizations to measure, to track, and to report back on their emission reductions over time. Thirdly, targets build trust. So investors, regulators, customers, they're all demanding transparency and they want to see real action on climate change. So by setting strong targets, these demonstrate commitment and they reduce reputational or regulatory risks for your business. Fourthly, targets create competitive advantage. What we see is that companies with ambitious targets, they often innovate faster, they reduce their energy costs, they position themselves ahead of their competitors as the markets transition to a preference for low carbon solutions. And ultimately, finally, point number 5 is that targets support global climate goals. So when we add up individual company and country targets across the world, then these collectively drive progress towards achieving net zero commitments by 2050. Now, targets themselves can take different forms. You can set absolute targets, which, for example, is reducing total emissions by 50% by 2030. Or you can set intensity-based targets, for example, reducing the emissions per unit of production. So that's typically reducing your product carbon footprint. And then you can set net zero targets, where all remaining emissions are balanced with removals by a certain date, which is often set as 2050. Now, when it comes to target setting, people often use the terms carbon neutral and net zero interchangeably, but they're not exactly the same thing. When we speak about carbon neutrality, this means balancing your emissions. So usually by purchasing offsets so that the emissions you release are effectively cancelled out. For example, if a company emits 1,000 tons of CO2 and then the company buys 1,000 tons worth of offsets from, say, for example, a tree planting project, then that company can claim carbon neutrality. Net zero, on the other hand, goes further, and it means actually reducing emissions as close to zero as possible across your entire value chain. And then only using removals for the very small or residual amount of greenhouse gases that is left. Net zero is aligned more towards the science of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, whereas carbon neutrality can sometimes be achieved without actually reducing real emissions. So the key difference is this. Carbon neutrality balances today's footprint, while net zero actually transforms the way an organization operates to eliminate emissions in the long run. So now that we understand why setting climate targets is so important, the next question is, how do we set them? This is where frameworks come in. And frameworks provide the structure and guidance that can help organizations to set targets that are credible, that are science-aligned, and aligned with global climate goals. So as you can see from the slide, there are several frameworks available for organizations to use. And I'm going to just briefly touch on some of them. So first, we have the Transition Pathway Initiative, or TPI. Now, this is an investor-led tool that assesses how prepared companies are to transition to a low-carbon economy. And it helps investors to evaluate whether the business's targets and strategies are truly aligned to climate goals. And then we have the Paris Aligned Investment Initiative, also for investors. Now, this framework supports investors in aligning their portfolios with the Paris Agreement. Essentially, it helps to make sure that investment strategies contribute to limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Third, we have the One Planet Science-Based Targets framework. Now, this helps companies to set ambitious science-based targets, and it emphasizes measurable reductions, not just offsetting. And then there is ACT, Assessing Low Carbon Transition Framework. This one provides a methodology for evaluating how well a company's transition strategy aligns with low carbon pathways. It's used to track progress and drive accountability for corporates. Then we have the ISO standards that are available for target setting. First, we have ISO 14068, which focuses on climate change management. And this standard provides requirements for organizations that are aiming to achieve and validate carbon neutrality claims. So remember the difference between climate carbon neutrality and net zero. Building on the ISO 14068, ISO published the net zero guidelines. Now, these are high-level recommendations that have been developed with input from more than 100 countries, and they give governments, businesses, and organizations a common reference point for what credible net zero should actually look like. Now, ISO is currently formalizing the guidelines into a formal ISO net zero standard, which will go further by creating a formal certifiable framework for net zero targets and strategies. So it's expected that this net zero standard will be published later this year. And finally, we have Science-Based Targets Initiative, or more commonly known as SBTI. Now, this is widely regarded as the gold standard for setting climate targets. SBTI provides clear science-based methodologies to align a business's emissions reductions with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So in practice, this means that companies commit to targets that are consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The strength of SBTI lies in its credibility. So the targets that businesses set are independently validated, and this gives your investors, your regulators, and customers confidence that the company's climate commitments are both ambitious and that they're science aligned. Now, many leading companies worldwide have already adopted SBTI targets, and the framework is seen as a benchmark for best practice. That said, there is a downside. Achieving SBTI validation is resource intensive. It requires time, it requires expertise, and there is financial investment required as well, which can be a challenge for smaller organizations. But despite the effort involved, the credibility and trust that comes from SBTI approval often outweighs the costs. So in short, SBTI is the framework that companies should look to when they want to demonstrate true leadership and accountability on climate action. Now, when it comes to setting climate targets, it is quite a technical process. And here are just some of the key concepts that organizations need to consider in the process. So firstly, you need to have a clear emissions baseline. The base year in particular becomes your reference point. So it has to be accurate, it must be comprehensive, and typically aligned to a framework like the GHG Protocol. Secondly, it's really recommended to include Scope 3. Even though it's complex, Scope 3 often makes up the largest share of emissions, and many frameworks like the SBTI, for example, require Scope 3 targets as mandatory. Thirdly, your targets must be aligned with the latest science. So that means choosing a pathway, like the 1.5 degrees Celsius or the 2 degrees Celsius pathway that is consistent with the IPCC carbon budgets and in some cases your sector's realities as well. You also have the choice of selecting the type of target you want to set. Absolute reductions over intensity targets are generally more credible, especially for net zero commitments, and they're more emphasized by most frameworks. Now, targets should also be for short-term and long-term. Short-term goals with annual reporting are critical for accountability, whereas long-term goals, they're typically not seen as being progressive enough. For some industries, sector-specific pathways and tools do exist, and these provide realistic and tailored decarbonization roadmaps that you can refer to for your organization. Now, very, very importantly, targets must be integrated into a governance and strategy. It's not just a sustainability team's task, okay? So it requires executive buy-in, capital allocation, and accountability across the whole business. Another important factor is ensuring transparency. So to build trust, there must be transparency, and this can be achieved through third-party validation. Public disclosure, independent verification, for example, enhances credibility with your stakeholders. And then another point is that offsets should be used wisely. Reductions should always come first. Frameworks like SBTI, they don't even allow offsets for near-term targets. And when used, the offsets must be of high quality and they must be verifiable. Finally, the last consideration is regular monitoring and adjustment, which is essential. So as climate science improves, data and business realities evolve, targets should also be updated accordingly. So this is an example of a company that has set SBTI validated targets. This example is Air France KLM Group. So if you are setting SBTI targets, any person can log on to the SBTI website and can verify themselves if the organization has set targets and where they are in that process as well. Finally, let's talk about how companies can communicate their climate readiness. Okay, so this is a step that is fundamental. You can do all the important activities of building a climate readiness business, but it's very important that you clearly communicate this to your stakeholders as well. So one of the most effective ways of doing this is through publishing a climate transition action plan, or CTAP for short. Now, a climate transition action plan is essentially a structured roadmap, and it shows how an organization will transition its operations, and in some cases, its investment portfolios, into achieving net zero and to ensuring they are ready for a climate resilient future. Now, these plans are becoming increasingly expected, not just by investors, but also by regulators, by employees, and by civil society. So they help to ensure there's transparency, that there's accountability in the face of climate change. Now, you may ask what needs to be included in a transition action plan? What makes a strong CTAP? Firstly, it needs to include climate governance. So that means there needs to be board level oversights. There needs to be clear accountability across management and defined responsibilities for climate action. Secondly, there needs to be strategic ambition and targets, as we've just spoken about. So this includes clearly stating if there's a net zero commitment, if there's science-aligned interim targets in the short term, and it should ideally include full coverage. So cover ambitions across scope 1, 2, and 3. Thirdly, there should be an implementation plan that's communicated. So this would outline the concrete steps that the company will take, for example, electrifying operations, adopting renewable energy, working with supply chains, etc. And it should also include capital allocation for these initiatives. Fourthly, there should be a focus on a just transition and resilience. So this means considering the impact on workers, the impact on your communities and customers, and while also strengthening the resilience and operations of supply chains. policy engagement and advocacy is also an important element that one doesn't often think about. But companies, they need to make sure that their lobbying activities align with their climate goals and that they're actively supporting public policies that can actually enable decarbonization. Another important and fundamental consideration is disclosures and metrics. Okay, so this involves reporting on progress against targets using recognized standards, like we've mentioned, the TCFD, the GHG Protocol, and so forth. And finally, verification and insurance. Now, independent verification of emissions data and progress reports can help to really build credibility and trust with your stakeholders. So in short, your climate transition action plans, they're more than just a document. It actually is a signal of accountability and readiness. So it shows your stakeholders that the company not only has a vision for net zero, but it also has a credible and a transparent and a measurable plan to get there. So some of the other key considerations that you should keep in mind when preparing your climate transition action plan includes materiality. Okay, so ensure that the plan addresses the most significant climate risks and emission sources that are applicable to your organization. Secondly, it needs to be credible. Okay, so you can avoid greenwashing by using third-party verification and disclosing transparent methodologies that have been used in preparation of your reports. Thirdly is sectoral relevance. So try to align your plan with sector-specific decarbonization pathways. So many different sectors have voluntary frameworks that you can abide by and tools that are available for your specific industry. Fourthly is stakeholder engagement. So it's recommended that when you're preparing your transition plans that you include voices from your employees, from your communities, and from your investors so that you have a comprehensive transition plan. And finally, you need to consider adaptability. Build in mechanisms for updating the plan. As new science and policies and technologies emerge, your plan will likely change as well. So while there's no single universal framework that one can use for preparing a transition action plan, there's several recognized guidelines that can be used and that you can use to shape your report. Now, we've spoken about many of these already through today's webinar. There's many guidelines and frameworks that are available which cover a range of topics for addressing transition plans. So this ranges from identifying your climate risks to doing your carbon accounting, setting your targets, and there's even best practices in climate reporting. Now, it's important for a company to be aware of the frameworks that exist and the guidelines that are available and applicable to your type of company. So as we wrap up today's webinar, I want to summarize the key steps of becoming a climate-ready business. Okay. So it all starts with the materiality assessment, understanding which ESG issues matter to your business and to your stakeholders. The next step is establishing a baseline. So that means actually collecting accurate data on your current performance, whether that's greenhouse gas emissions, which we've spoken about today, but this baseline can also include other metrics like your resource usage, the waste that you produce, and other social metrics. So from there, it's advisable that you set ambitious targets that are aligned with global standards like SBTi, for example, or the net zero commitments, or even sustainable development goals. Then it's about developing your climate transition action plan. Now, this defines the pathways to meet your targets, whether it's through energy transition, adopting circular economy practices, supply chain engagement, or product innovation, for example. Now, it's important that these targets need to be integrated into strategy and governance. So this means embedding sustainability into corporate strategy, into risk management, into your board oversight, and even executive incentives. You'll also want to focus on engaging stakeholders. So from employees to suppliers and customers, investors, communities, All of these stakeholders help to build momentum and to share the ownership towards becoming a climate resilient organization. The next step is actually implementing the initiatives. And that's where your projects like renewable energy adoption, energy efficiency programs, sustainable sourcing, diversity initiatives all come to life in this stage. And of course, you must disclose and report your progress transparently. We've spoken about many standards that are available to guide you in this process, from TCFD, CSRD, GRI to SASB. Using external assurance where appropriate can help to improve your credibility and create trust with your stakeholders. Finally, it's important to monitor, to review, and improve your performance. So track your KPIs, audit performance, and continuously strengthen your approach as standards, expectations, and science does evolve over time. Now, not every company will follow the exact same journey, but being aware of these key activities, the tools, the frameworks, and the guidelines that's available for you will all help to build a credible and effective climate change strategy for your organization. So I'd like to thank you for your time today and for joining us in this webinar. I hope that it was of use and interesting for you. So please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions on the topics that we have covered today, or if you have any questions on how to go about conducting any of these activities, please feel free to reach out to us. So at this point, I will stop and hand back to Adrian.
Thanks very much to Sandy and Nolene. You can see that the virtual round of applause has been made. So on behalf of everyone that joined the webinar, a big thank you to you both for your preparation and for putting together the webinar. I've taken the liberty of sharing both Nolene and Sandy's email addresses. So please do feel free to get in touch with them. Our Cape Town office address is also on the slide there. You can also get in touch with us via phone, and our very helpful reception desk will direct you to our appropriate phone contacts as well. So thank you so much for joining today. We look forward to seeing you in the third and final webinar in this current webinar series, which will take place on the 2nd of October. Hopefully you've already diarized that. And we plan to be running similar webinars on other ESG themes going forward. And we look forward to staying in touch and hearing from you about any particular questions you may have or any support that you may wish to explore with the Six Capitals team. So with that, thank you so much for joining and have a great day further. All the very best. Bye-bye.